Very glad to be here and good to see all of you. I have a message this morning that I want to share about love. And I've entitled this message, Loving on Purpose. Now, if there are people that we get along with, there are people that we like, loving them is not difficult usually, is it? We don't struggle to be able to love people that we agree with or get along with. It's the people that are difficult. It's the people with whom we have disagreement, conflict, tension. These are the people that are more difficult to love. But God calls us to love our neighbor as ourself, and God calls us to love one another. So we have to find a way. How do we do that? What does that look like? What does it look like to love on purpose? I want to look at one record in the early church, and I want to go through it in some detail, and then kind of draw out some of the lessons we can learn from it on how to be purposeful in loving. So if you guys want to turn with me, I'll share my screen here, and we're going to go to Acts chapter 15. We're going to look at the incident here with Paul and Barnabas. Now, right before this record, Paul and Barnabas, they were in Jerusalem at the Jerusalem Council, and they also then traveled and spent some time in Antioch in Syria. And so then here in verse 36, it says, "And after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, 'Let's return and visit the brothers in every city in which we proclaimed the word of the Lord, and see how they are,'" meaning see how they're doing, how they're faring, how things are going. Now, Barnabas is a fellow companion of Paul, and he gets introduced previously in the book of Acts. He's from the island of Cyprus, and his name is actually Joseph, but his last name is Barnabas, and that's the name that he goes by. It's his surname. Now, Barnabas and Paul in Antioch, they have this idea of, let's go see the people that we spoke the word to. And he's referring to the cities and the believers who embraced the good news, the message of Christ on the first missionary journey. And so he's like, let's go back and let's visit them. Let's see how they're doing. Let's see if there's a way that we can serve them, to edify, build them up, to strengthen them in the faith. Now, verse 37. Now, Barnabas was intending to take John, who is called Mark, with them also. But Paul was thinking it was not appropriate to take with them the one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and did not go with them to the work, meaning did not go along with them to do the work of ministry. So Barnabas wants to bring along John, and John's name is Mark, so I'll refer to him as Mark. And so he proposes to bring Mark with him again on the second missionary journey. But Paul doesn't think that this is a good idea. And he doesn't think so because Paul says that he doesn't want to bring the one who had withdrawn from them. Now, I want to give a little context here for what Paul's referring to. And this occurs previously in Acts chapter 13. But let's look here, and we'll do a little tracing here of the first missionary journey. So they're over here in Antioch, in Syria. And the first journey, they came down here to Cyprus, to Salamis, then Paphos. Then they came on up here to Perga. And Perga is in the region of Pamphylia. Now, if we go back and we go to Acts chapter 13. And if we read Acts 13, in verse 13, this is part in the middle of the first missionary journey. It says, "Now Paul and his companions," this included Barnabas and included John Mark or Mark, "they set sail from Paphos," which is on the southwestern corner of Cyprus, "and they came to Perga in Pamphylia. But John," this is John Mark, so Mark here, John Mark, "he departed from them and returned to Jerusalem." So when Paul talks about not wanting to bring Mark with them as the one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia, this is the incident he's referring to. You see, they were on their way in their missionary journey together, and after they had left Cyprus and come to the mainland, which is modern-day Turkey, and they arrived at Perga, apparently Mark departs from their company and goes back to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem's down here in this direction. So that poses a problem. Now, Perga, when they arrive in Perga, was it an issue with Perga itself? Well, I don't think so. I mean, this is ancient Perga right here. It's an amazing archaeological site. There's a lot of the city that has been excavated that you can see. There's a large amphitheater. There's a stadium for horse races. And then this right here is this is Main Street, right down through the middle of the city. And this was a major metropolis. Some have speculated that when Paul and his companions, when they got to Perga and Mark decides to abandon them, that this might have been due to what had happened on the island of Cyprus, where if we read in the book of Acts, when they were in Paphos, they came and they talked with the proconsul there, Sergius Paulus. And also there was a false prophet there named Bar-Jesus or Elymas, the sorcerer. And they had a confrontation with Elymas, and eventually Paul rebuked Elymas, and they won over Sergius Paulus, and he believed the word that Paul and his companions had spoken to him, and he was converted to the faith. Now, this is a Gentile, and perhaps John Mark, as a Jew, seeing Paul working with the Gentiles in this way. Now, this was before the Jerusalem Council, where they kind of ruled in favor of what Paul was doing among the Gentiles. Perhaps John Mark wasn't comfortable with what Paul was doing and the way that he was interacting with Gentiles apart from the Jewish synagogue and the practices of Judaism. But we don't know. We don't know why Mark decided to leave the company of Paul. Well, let's go back to Acts 15. In verse 39, it says, "And there arose a sharp disagreement." This is between Barnabas and Paul, "so that they separated from one another. And Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus." Now, one thing to note here is there is a family relationship between Barnabas and Mark. They're cousins. But I don't think this is the reason why Barnabas took an exceptional interest in Mark. Perhaps Barnabas recognized the full potential of Mark for ministry and knew that he needed another chance to prove that he was indeed valuable for the mission of the good news. Now, when Paul and Barnabas, they have this disagreement. Barnabas wants to bring Mark. Paul doesn't want to bring Mark. Was Paul right? Was Barnabas wrong, or vice versa? Well, I think we can rightly assume that Barnabas had good reasons for opposing Paul in this matter. He wasn't just trying to be a stick in the mud or cause trouble for the outreach efforts of Paul. But Barnabas must have seen something in Mark that was worth advocating for him. And, some think that maybe Barnabas should have submitted to Paul and his authority. I mean, Paul clearly was an apostle. But Barnabas was not some green thumb minister who was wet behind the ears. He'd been with Paul through the mission field on the first missionary journey. So he wasn't some newbie. Well, according to Luke, he doesn't identify whether one is right or one is wrong. They had a disagreement. And it seems like they made a mutual decision to go separate ways, since neither could agree with the other. Barnabas was in favor of Mark, and Paul wasn't, and they couldn't meet in the middle. So I think, in a way, perhaps both Barnabas and Paul were correct in this matter. Because if Paul couldn't trust Mark based on his past experience, then it probably would have been foolish for Paul to let Mark come along with them. That wouldn't have posed well for their teamwork together, as teams require trust. Now, I think Barnabas was also correct in not giving up on Mark and being willing to work with him and to help him grow and to develop into a mature leader. And that happens by mentorship. That happens by apprenticeship. And in that world, bringing Mark along with him was the way to achieve that. Now, as they go and they travel on separate missionary journeys here after this point, we don't have any information as to where Barnabas and Mark went, but they went off on their own missionary journey. And we do learn kind of where Paul goes on his missionary journey. And we don't have any information of, Mark joining Paul in ministry in his future travels. But we do learn that Mark and Paul eventually do reconcile. And we learn that Paul approves of Barnabas's view of what he saw in Mark and in giving him a second chance in the work of ministry. In Colossians chapter 4, at the end of his letter to the Colossians, which in this letter takes place later on in Paul's ministry, this is at least after his second missionary journey, perhaps part of when he's undertaken his third missionary journey. He says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. Now, this is a much different tone for Paul if he has this suspicion of Mark or this disapproval that Mark is a turntail or whatnot from his experience on the first missionary journey. So clearly, something has changed. Paul now sees Mark as someone whom the Colossians are supposed to welcome, meaning that he views Mark as an official delegate and representative of the ministry. And so if you were going to tell somebody that somebody was coming to visit and they were supposed to greet them and welcome them, you would do so only if you vouch for the character and person to whom they're going to receive. You wouldn't tell your friends or your family that somebody's going to come visit and then to welcome them if you think that they're a deceiver, if you think that they're a fraud, if you think that they're going to, steal or harm your family in some way, or be, lie to them. You don't do that. You endorse people that you trust, that you know the character of. And I think we can rightly presume here that that is the case now with Mark. Paul views Mark in a different light than he did previously. And here, as Paul is writing to Colossians, I think this is also a clear endorsement of Mark in the ministry. But what is even more revealing about Paul's heart toward Mark, I think, comes later on in his life when he writes the pastoral letters to Timothy. And in Timothy, if you want to turn to 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul's writing to Timothy, which is another younger minister who had been kind of a pupil, a trainee of Paul's. And he says here, he tells Timothy that only Luke is with me. So get Mark, he tells Timothy, go get Mark and bring him with you. Why? Because Paul says he is useful to me in the ministry. So sometime between the start of Paul's second missionary journey, when he didn't want anything to do with Mark, and Barnabas took Mark and went off on their own to Cyprus, between that point and here, after his missionary journeys and after many years, Paul now has a different viewpoint. His attitude has changed. He says he found Mark now to be worthy and highly valuable to him in ministry. Perhaps the turn of events, maybe between these 2 points in time, is because both of them have changed. I think on Mark's side, Mark must have undergone some development, some growth as a minister and as a leader. And this is something that Paul now recognizes and approves. But also, I think Paul's reluctance and his resistance to want to have Mark be part of his ministry and missionary journeys, I think, is because he recognizes and has grown himself that his former judgment perhaps was too harsh, or that even if it was proper in its time, that's not a static way that he should perceive Mark, and that he should extend more grace to Mark as Barnabas had done. Because Barnabas was with Paul in the first missionary journey. Barnabas experienced the abandonment of Mark in the first missionary journey. It's not like Barnabas and Paul have different experiences of Mark. They both were there. But Barnabas looked at Mark and treated Mark differently than Paul. We don't know specifics, but we do know whatever it was, whatever the reasons Barnabas had for wanting to continue working with Mark, they turned out to be correct. For in the end, Mark has become a valuable leader in the early church. And lastly, we know that Mark grew and became a great leader because Peter, the Apostle Peter, one of the pillars in the early church, he mentions Mark. And if you want to we're going to look at 1 Peter chapter 5. In verse 13, Peter writes, "The church that is in Babylon, who is chosen together with you, greets you, and so does my son, Mark." Now, we know Mark is not actually Peter's son, in the same way that Timothy is not Paul's son. These are just terms of endearment. And so here we know that Mark became close with Peter. And so much so that he's now referred to, Peter looks at him with this term of affection that Mark is my son. And so as he's writing this letter, he includes greetings from Mark. And if Mark was not now a prominent leader, a prominent minister, this would not have happened. Peter would not have used Mark's name here unless Mark had changed and Mark had demonstrated the qualities and character of a minister of the gospel, the good news. And finally, I think one more point to commend Mark and the change that happened is that Mark wrote one of our gospels according to church tradition. The gospels are anonymous writings. We don't have any, there's no authorship mentioned in them. But according to early church tradition, Mark wrote one of the Gospels, and we have it. It's called the Gospel according to Mark. And this might be perhaps one of the earliest, if not maybe the first Gospel. You know, we don't have any dates of composition by which to judge the Gospels, so we can't really be sure exactly when they were written. But Mark came to be associated with this Gospel that we have. And so his name, going from being a turncoat who has abandoned the mission of spreading the good news with the Apostle Paul and Barnabas, to becoming a leader in the church, being viewed by Peter as a son in the faith, and his name being attributed to one of the Gospels we have in Scripture. That's quite a reversal. John messed up, John Mark. It's not that difficult to see. He abandoned Paul and Barnabas halfway through their first missionary journey. But did he just tuck his tail between his legs and crawl in a hole somewhere, never to be seen or heard from again? No. Mark ends up becoming a very significant figure in the early church. And I think this whole incident and some of this context that I'm trying to show you here, I think there are a few principles that we can learn from it as to how to love on purpose, because I think that was a major catalyst in why Mark went from being low, like a zero, all the way to a hero. So I want to share, I think, 3 things that I saw from this record. I think the first one is to love on purpose, that we should not hold a past fault against someone indefinitely. If that were the case, then Mark would have been disqualified from ministry from that point on. We're supposed to give people a chance to show that they've changed. And not necessarily immediately. You know, if somebody makes a mistake, it takes time to learn from that mistake and then to grow from that mistake. But we should be willing to give people second chances. Like I mentioned before, Barnabas experienced Mark's abandonment in Pamphylia as much as Paul did. But he didn't abandon Mark. He knew that Mark would be a good leader and useful to Christ in the ministry. Otherwise, I don't think he would have stuck his neck out like he did and stood up for Mark like he did. He didn't give up on Mark. He gave him a second chance despite his past fault. Second, we need to be willing to offer someone help to grow and become more mature. We all change with time. The question is, will we change for the better? None of us are fully mature in Christ in every way. We all have some growing to do. But positive change in our lives or another's rarely happens without positive influences and support to guide us in the right direction for our benefit or for theirs. Barnabas saw that Mark needed help, and he was willing to work with him despite what had happened. I mean, he told Paul that he thought Mark should come with them. And when Paul didn't agree, he held fast to that conviction and agreed to take Mark and go off and do ministry with Mark. And this was during the time of Paul's second missionary journey. Now, this time with Barnabas was likely very formative for Mark and was probably the essence of what built the foundation for all the coming years of ministry that Mark would have in his life. And also, Mark was not too proud to admit his mistake. Now, how do we know that? Well, we don't have an explicit account of his apology, but it seems reasonable to deduce that Barnabas would not have stood beside Mark and advocated for him if Mark wasn't repentant, or if Barnabas thought Mark was just going to flake on him again. There was some reason Barnabas was confident Mark was a good choice. Lastly, we need to be willing to stand behind someone if we believe in them. People need to know that you believe in them, especially if they have let us down in the past. If someone has changed and has repented of their mistake, there's probably nothing more healing than for you to tell them and for them to hear that you forgive them and that you are standing with them. We all need encouragement, especially after we've made a grievous mistake. And there is some irony here, I think, in the name Barnabas and the role that Barnabas played in this whole record. Back in Acts chapter 3, where Barnabas is introduced. This is Acts chapter 4, Acts 4:36. The name Barnabas means son of encouragement. And it would be Barnabas who would stand behind Mark and recommend him to be considered for ministry on the second missionary journey, despite what had happened on the first trip. Now, I don't think Barnabas thought everything was just fine with Mark, but I can see in the text that Barnabas believed in Mark to the point that he was willing to disagree with Paul and go a separate way for a time to do ministry apart from him. Now, this doesn't mean that Paul and Barnabas broke up and that Barnabas went off and started his own ministry or something, but simply that Barnabas and Paul recognized that they would continue in ministry together, but they would not travel together. There's nothing in the text that shows hard feelings of Barnabas and Paul toward each other. It seems to be that their disagreement was resolved by a mutual agreement. Barnabas would take Mark, and they would travel to Cyprus and on from there, doing ministry and going back. Now, what they're doing, it seems, is they're following the path of the first missionary journey. And that Paul would then travel on by himself with others, such as Silas, and that they would do ministry elsewhere. In conclusion, I think loving on purpose is tough. I think if it was easy, we would all be able to do it without having to exert much effort or be willing to sort of put ourselves out there. I think when Barnabas showed he was loving Mark on purpose, I think that took a lot of courage. I mean, the Apostle Paul is not the Pope or anything, but the Apostle Paul is the Apostle Paul. And Barnabas was like, hey, man, I think Mark should come with us. I think that he is helpful and useful, and he will be a great minister. And Mark was like, no way. I don't think that conversation was easy. But I think Barnabas showed loving on purpose requires effort, requires courage, requires us to step into uncomfortable spaces. And so if we have these three things in mind, I think, on how to love on purpose, if we will be willing to not hold someone's faults against them indefinitely, if we'll be willing to offer help to someone so they can grow and become more mature, or if it's ourselves that we are humble enough to receive help and guidance so that we can become stronger and we can become more mature in Christ. And lastly, we need to tell people that we believe in them. We need to encourage people so that they know that we stand in solidarity with them. That will do more for them than I think we will ever know. So these are a few things I had to share on loving on purpose, and I appreciate your attention. God bless you guys.